Y5&6. But, exclaimed Kate, didn't he see them come out? No, Mrs. Driver came along then, in a flurry of annoyance because they were late for the train. She buzzed him into the cab because she wanted to get back again, she said, as fast as she could to be in at the death. Kate was silent a moment, looking down. So that is the end, she said at last. Yes, said Mrs. May, it could be. But, Kate raised a worried face, perhaps they didn't escape through the grating. Perhaps they were killed after all. Oh, they escaped all right, said Mrs. May lightly. But how do you know? I just know, said Mrs. May. But how did they get across those fields with the cows and things and the crows? They walked, I suppose. The Hendreries did it. People can do anything when they have a mind to. But poor Homily, she'd be so upset. Yes, she was upset, said Mrs. May. And how would they know the way? By the gas pipe, said Mrs. May. There's a kind of ridge all along through the spinney and across the fields. You see, when men dig a trench and put a pipe in it, all the earth they've dug out doesn't quite fit when they've put it back. The ground looks different. But poor Homily, she didn't have her tea or furniture or her carpets or anything. Do you suppose they took anything? Oh, people always grab something, said Mrs. May shortly. The oddest things sometimes, if you've read about shipwrecks. She spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. Do be careful, child. Not grey next to pink. You have to unpick it. But, went on Kate in a despairing voice as she picked up the scissors, Homily would hate to arrive there all poor and destitute in front of Loopy. Destitute, said Mrs. May patiently. And Loopy wasn't there, remember. Loopy never came back, and Homily would tie on her apron and think at once, these poor motherless boys. Were they all boys? Yes, harpsichords and clocks, and they'd spoil Ariette dreadfully. What did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think? Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They could live very well. Badgers' sets are almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they could store and grind into flour just as humans do. It was all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. They had honey, they could make elderflower tea and lime tea, they had hips and haws and blackberries and sloes and wild strawberries. The boys could fish in the stream, and a minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel is to you. They had birds' eggs, for any amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelettes. You see, they would know where to look for things, and they had greens and salads, of course. Think of a salad made of those tender shoots of young hawthorn, bread and cheese we used to call it, with sorrel and dandelion and a sprinkling of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember. It wasn't for nothing that the clocks had lived under the kitchen. But the danger, cried Kate. The weasels and the crows and the stoats and all those things. Yes, agreed Mrs. May. Of course there was danger. There's danger everywhere, but no more for them than there was for many human beings. At least, they didn't have wars. And what about the early settlers in America, and those people who farm in the middle of the big game country in Africa and on edge of jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals. Few animals kill for the sake of killing. Even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting. They will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. These were boys, remember. They would learn to hunt for the pot and how to protect themselves. I don't suppose Ariette and Homily would wander far afield. Ariette would, said Kate. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, laughing. I suppose Ariette might. So they'd have meat, said Kate. Yes, sometimes, but borrowers are borrowers, not killers. I think, said Mrs. May, that if a stoat, say, killed a partridge, they would borrow a leg. And if a fox killed a rabbit, they used the fur. Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing, said Kate, when they had a little roast, they'd skinned haws and baked them, would they taste like brown potatoes? Perhaps, said Mrs. May. But they couldn't cook in a badger set. I suppose they cooked out of doors. How would they keep warm in winter then? Do you know what I think? Said Mrs. May. She laid down her work and leaned in forward a little. I think that they didn't live in a badger set at all. I think they used it with all its passages and storerooms as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None, but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led at last to their home. Borrowers loved passages, and they loved gates, and they loved to live a long way from their front doors. Where would they live then? I was wondering, said Mrs. May, about the gas pipe. Oh yes, cried Kate, I see what you mean. The soil's all soft and sandy up there. I think they'd go right through the badger set and dig out a circular chamber level with the gas pipe. And off this chamber, all around it, there'd be little rooms like cabins. And I think, said Mrs. May, that they'd bore 3 little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny that you could hardly see it, and that one would always be a light. The other 2 would have stoppers in them, which, when they wanted to light the gas, they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner. That's where they'd cook, and that would give them light. But would they be so clever? But they are clever, Mrs. May assured her. Very clever. Much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember. But they'd want a little air hole. Oh, said Mrs. May quickly, they did have one. How do you know? Asked Kate. Because once when I was up there, I smelled hot pot. Oh, cried Kate excitedly. She twisted round and knelt up on the hassock. So you did go up there? So that's how you know? You saw them too? No, said Mrs. May, drawing back a little in her chair. I never saw them. Never. But you went up there. You know something. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there. Mrs. May stared back into Kate's eager face. Hesitant she seemed, almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded at last, I'll tell you for what it's worth. When I went to stay in that house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went into the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so again Mrs. May hesitated, almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out of the doll's house and put it in a pillowcase and took it up there. I bought things too out of my pocket money, tea and coffee beans and sugar and pepper and cloves and a great packet of lump sugar, and I took a whole lot of little pieces of silk which were over from making a patchwork quilt. And I took them some fish bones for needles. I took the tiny thimble I had got in a Christmas pudding and a whole collection of scraps and cracker things that I had in a chocolate box. But you never saw them? No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank below the hawthorn hedge. It was a lovely bank, twined in twisted hawthorn roots and riddled with sandy holes, and there were wood violets and primroses and early campion. From the top of the bank you could see for miles across the fields. You could see the woods and the valleys and the twisting lanes. You could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming and watching beetles and ants, I found an oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry, and there was a hole bored in one side of it, and a slice off the top. The teapot! Exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called then, down all the holes as my brother had done, but no one answered. Next day, when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone. And everything in it. Yes, everything. I searched the ground for yards around, in case there might be a scrap of silk or coffee bean, but there was nothing. Of course, somebody passing might have just picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, said Mrs. May, smiling, that I smelt hot pot. And which was the day? Asked Kate. That you found Ariette's diary? Mrs. May laid down her work. Kate, she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. What makes you say that? Her cheeks had become quite pink. I guessed, said Kate. I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me. Like reading somebody else's diary. It wasn't the diary, said Mrs. May hastily, but her cheeks had become even pinker. It was the book called Memoranda, the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it, and it wasn't on that day I found it, but 3 weeks later, the day before I left. Kate sat silent, staring at Mrs. May. After a while, she drew a long breath. Then that proves it, she said finally. Underground chamber and all. Not quite, said Mrs. May. Why not? Asked Kate. Ariette used to make her E's like little half moons with a stroke in the middle. Well, said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took up her work again. My brother did too, she said.